Welcome to the 1980s, the decade of new wave music and bizarre fashion, and the first decade on our little time travel trip that I actually haven't been alive for. So it's the first time that I hadn't really been around to experience the culture that these shows came out from. I'd like to say that would make my opinions here completely unbiased, or at least from the perspective of a neutral observer, but I don't think that's going to be entirely true. I've noticed that people tend to have a bias against cartoons from the decade after they stopped being kids, and the decade from before they were born. My parents did show me some of the shows that they watched back in the day, and I had a hard time understanding how they could have ever been into any of them. Up until I did this list, my impression of the 1980s was that it was all either overly saccharine slog, all of the Get-Along gang, or a huge ocean of 22-minute toy commercials. Those things definitely exist. However, as I did more and more research, I could tell that my initial impressions were wrong. I've learned that the 1980s were fucking insane. Fun fact, during class one day, we watched a video that the students had made back during the 1980s. And my first thought when watching it was, oh my god, they really did dress like that. Like, with how much of the 1980s tends to get mocked as a decade, it's easy to just dismiss a lot of it as parody. Like, this has to be exaggerated. There was no way people actually dressed, acted, or thought like that. But no, a lot of it is entirely accurate. For as weird and wild as some of the cartoons in this day and age claim to be, the main theme I now associate with the 80s is just weird and wild. Remember, this is the era that brought us Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and robots that transform into cars. And those ideas are still around today because they're some of the more sane cartoons from this era. If I were to make a list of the weirdest cartoons of all time, it would be loaded with 80s shows, possibly more so than anime shows. This decade was no stranger to giving us things like Jace and the Wheeled Warriors. Like, what even is this? Fantasy warriors in outer space riding dump trucks against evil alien plants that shoot lasers. And Jace's team apparently has a robot, a magician, and a little girl. The weirdest thing that the 2010s has is, what? Adventure Time? There is no competition. The rules are mostly the same as always. Every show on this list must have had at least 13 episodes, aired in the 1980s, and I need to be able to find footage, obviously. I have this rule because if something has its plug pulled before then it's safe to say that it was seen for the mistake that it was. 13 episodes is what you need to have a full season of a show. The shows on this list were what people actually watched during the day. Although I wouldn't blame you if you didn't know that anything on this list existed. Let's just say that there are some 80s properties that even the most desperate corporate hack isn't going to want to reboot. I do have one new rule though. I'm not going to put any shows that I've already reviewed on this list. All 3 of the 80s ones. Garbage Pail Kids probably wouldn't make it anyway, and I'll tell you where the others actually would have been. But I want to give some new trash a chance to shine. Actually, shine is probably not the right word to use in that metaphor. Let's give some new trash a chance to smell. Let's you and me embark on this journey. With the cartoons that I'm going to show you, this is going to be a treat for both of us. Or, at least for you, it's probably going to be a nightmare for me. Alright, let's count down. Top 10 worst cartoons of the 1980s.
Chuck Norris stars in Chuck Norris Karate Commandos. Chuck Norris, he's got nerves of steel and strength to match.
Here's the mystery. On my show, the best show. Mr. T.
I can't take this kind of pressure. I must confess, one more dusty road would be just a road too long.
The biggest stereotype of the 1980s is that literally every cartoon was basically a toy commercial. And there's definitely a lot of truth to that. He-Man, My Little Pony, Transformers, each of them had a toy line. Actually, each of them existed because they had a toy line. And the 80s is definitely responsible for the trend that lasts to this day, where if a cartoon isn't selling enough toys, then it's deemed a failure and cancelled. For years and years before the 80s, though, it was actually illegal to make a cartoon that was just a commercial. It's the reason that the 60s Hot Wheels cartoon was cancelled. But in 1984, these limitations were stripped back, and it became a free-for-all. It was determined that the market would decide what was good for kids to watch. It was a decision so bad and corporately driven that you'd think Ajit Pai made it. But it wasn't long before every single toy in existence had a cartoon. You might think I'm joking, but every toy had a cartoon, including the Rubik's Cube. I don't even know why I'm surprised. A terrible merchandise-driven cartoon based on the Rubik's Cube is like the most 80s thing in the world. If you want to know what the bad side of 80s animation looks like in one fell swoop, watch this show. You know, if you could find an episode, it was harder than it should have been. You'd probably think that this show was actually like the trend gone foul. Kind of like Mega Babies was a gross-out cartoon that tried to go above and beyond the trend of gross-out. This was a cartoon that could only exist because of so many other ridiculous toy-based cartoons getting greenlit, making it seem sane. No. This was actually one of the first cartoons in the toy-based trend, coming in right at 1983, and lasting for a blessedly short 13 episodes. And boy, is it the perfect template for selling out. First of all, they gave this Rubik's Cube this god-awful gremlin face. That thing is hideous! Why would you do something like that? Why would you put that face on the Rubik's Cube? It doesn't look cute. It looks like it wants to eat the character's brains! Especially because you're trying to sell Rubik's Cubes. But if you think that's bad, listen to its voice.
Somebody else had a problem too.
Not only does it look like a gremlin, it sounds like one too.
Got him.
Without his powers, I think Rubik is scared of heights.
There. Oh, thanks, Carlos. But Lisa still has problems. Right to break promise.
But I can get past all that. Actually, no, I can't get past that. Fuck this design. Like, how do you make a Rubik's Cube, which is just a fucking cube, how do you make a Rubik's Cube look so goddamn hideous? But if you can get past that, this thing actually has some more tools in its arsenal to make you hate it. As in, the Rubik's Cube is actually a sanctimonious piece of shit. So, the premise of the show actually has, nothing to do with puzzles. Instead, it's that these kids have a magic cube thing that has unlimited magic powers. But every episode is pretty much the Rubik's Cube telling the kids why using his powers are a bad idea. It's like the Fairly OddParents, but just post-poof Wanda for 22 minutes. Seriously though, this little shit is overpowered to the 9th degree. So much that he's able to know the plot ahead of time. In one episode, two goons are trying to get everyone to run away from an orphanage with a giant boulder for, I don't know, pick any typical bad guy reason. I think it was because of money. And the cube knows that they did it because writing is hard. Ignoring that, the animation is really choppy and reminiscent of Hanna-Barbera. The voice acting is really, really bad. The kids who play the kids clearly don't know how to act. And all of these characters are super bland. Normally I'd bring these things up first and foremost, but well, when we're talking about the 80s, these are kind of the rule and not the exception. Most characters were bland and boring. Most animation was pretty damn choppy. Bringing that up is like bringing up the fact that most of the worst cartoons of the 2000s were made in cheap flash animation. Most of the cartoons on this list are going to have these problems, so just assume that comes standard. I know that the question, how do you write a show about the Rubik's Cube, has no answers, but something tells me that they picked a particularly wrong answer. And you know what the absolute worst thing about this show is? The Rubik's Cube cartoon is only number 10 on this list. It only barely made it on. And if I were including the shows that I already reviewed, it wouldn't have made it on the list at all. I am beginning to regret this decision. All of my decisions. The problem with making a worst cartoons of each decade list is that generally what we think of as the flavor of a decade, the trends and stereotypes, they usually don't begin in like 1980 and then end in 1989. Now what we think of 2000s cartoons tends to start around 2004, and what we know of as 90s cartoons starts with DuckTales in 1987. The only time that a decade's flavor started at the start of a decade was in 2010. Like, the amount of change that happened in that year was just crazy. So a lot of the shows on this list can be better described as a 70s hangover, rather than a cartoon of the 80s. Case in point, Short Tales. I don't know what's more stupid, the name of the show or how it came about. If you thought that a show based on the Rubik's Cube was a stupid idea, the Short Tales characters were based on Hallmark greeting cards, which they apparently still sell for some reason. As you might imagine, like with the Garbage Pail Kids, there was no story to begin with, so they needed to find something to do. And you would not believe the genius idea these people did to give these cards some kind of story. Actually, you would if you knew who made this. This show is made by Hanna-Barbera, who decided in the 70s that being creative was overrated. So it's a Scooby-Doo ripoff. Actually, it feels more like a terrible precursor to Rescue Rangers. They're just typical park animals by day, mystery solvers by night. And would you just listen to that theme song?
Who do you call when you're caught in a jam?
Too scared to stay.
Too scared to scram.
It's a cinch.
Yeah, pinch.
You call
Timmy!
Rick, Digger, Mike,
And Bogey.
The Shirt Tail!
Yeah, that's one of the greats of the 80s. DuckTales, Mask, a pup named Scooby-Doo, and of course, Short Tales. And I love how the park keeper just shrugs at the end of it like, I don't know why we decided to make this a cartoon either. So, what's the actual show like? Well, half the time, the characters' thoughts appear on their shirt, so they can save money on voice actors. And for no other reason. Maybe it happened in the cards, I don't know. Almost every single scene transition just spins around like a newspaper. But other than that, it's the animation quality that was killing Hanna-Barbera at the time. Cookie cutter characters, cookie cutter animation, following the Scooby-Doo template. The first episode is about the characters trying to track down a suit of armor, which just gets up and walks out of the museum. The security guard doesn't even try to chase it down. The Short Tales have a car that's able to detect gold, and instead of mining, they're tracking down a suit of armor for a commissioner, who apparently doesn't know that you can't wear a green shirt in front of a green screen.
And they think they can keep Mr. Gold from bringing gold into the country.
Hey, I've got it. Mr. Gold is the gold smuggler.
I changed my mind. This is the most brilliant show in the history of television. I don't even know how to describe this one. Yeah, that California Raisins had a cartoon. You know what? I don't even know why I'm surprised. Most cartoons in the 1980s were made for advertising things. So why not just cut out the middleman and make a show out of an existing advertising mascot? Honestly, this is probably a little bit less surprising than our last entry on this list, because the California Raisins were actually really popular. Their design was created by Will Vinton, a legendary stop-motion animator who unfortunately passed away earlier this month. They appeared in an Emmy-winning animated short. Their signature song, which is the theme song for this show, even appeared on the Billboard Hot 100. They even almost had an NES game. They were pretty damn popular. So making a cartoon about raisin mascots wasn't the worst idea, at least at the time. Then again, pretty much everything that happened in the 1980s wasn't the worst idea at the time. It was a weird decade. Unfortunately, the cartoon is not good, and there's a reason for this. You might want to sit down and try to stay calm, because this is probably hard to believe. It's very, very hard to come up with ideas for a show about an anthropomorphic raisins. I mean, there was an idea behind the characters. The California Raisins were in a band, but the show really isn't about that. I mean, yeah, they're in a band in the show, but most episodes aren't about that. Their being in a band does have some effects on the show overall, like, the show is a musical, but they don't write their own songs or anything of the sort. They basically sing covers, and colossally miss the point of the songs that they do cover.
Before you ask some girl for a hand now, keep your freedom for as long as you can now. My mama told me, you better shop around.
You guys know that the song isn't literally about shopping, right? It's not like they're even changing the lyrics or anything. It's not a parody. It's just a straight up cover. But because they're doing it in a shopping mall, that means the song's different now, right? No. The song is still about not marrying the first girl you meet. Very kid-friendly song, by the way. The songs rarely have anything to do with, you know, the plots. They just randomly break into song at random points in the episode. But let me actually explain what the show is about.
Hey, check out those cute veggie girls.
I'm totally bummed. Like, I hid my plastic earrings in the microwave, okay? And, like, my mom, like, totally melted them.
Do you really want to know? The episode that I'm showing you clips from is about the California Raisins becoming the King of Luxembourg, or Luxemburger, or whatever they call it, because every single name in the show has to be a produce-based pun. However, this episode isn't a very good example of the overall show, because this actually has an interesting plot. Stop me if you've heard this one before. One of the characters learns that his diploma is invalid, so he needs to go back to high school. What about a camping episode? A family reunion episode? Even in the 1980s, these these were the most stock, cliche plots imaginable. You can imagine how boring they seem now. There are only 13 episodes. You'd think they'd come up with an original idea for at least a few of them. Not helping is the fact that all the raisins are mostly indistinguishable. The tall one talks with a different voice, but pretty much everyone has the same personality. They largely act the same, they largely talk the same. The California raisins are usually seen as one entity for a reason. They don't have established personalities. Like, when I found out that there was a California Raisins cartoon, I thought it would be more interesting than this. But no, this is one of the most boring, bland cartoons that I've ever seen. The theme song's pretty decent, though.
Here's our Too Cool license.
And our official registered trademark.
Next, please. Considering the amount of terrible video game cartoons that came out in the 80s, I needed to put at least one of them on the list. Immediately I thought the Super Mario Super Row Show. But nah, that one's really too corny to hate. At least it's entertainingly bad. Although the Zelda cartoon is a special kind of awful, but no, I had to go with the worst of them.
Wake up, Kid Icarus.
It's Congo Land.
Captain N, the Game Master.
Holy hell, where do we even begin? Captain N may as well be called Nintendo Power, the show. I mean, Captain N's powers come from the Power Glove, but literally, it could just run on Nintendo Power. Because the show is basically there to just market the latest Nintendo game, and showcase cool things that you'd beg your parents to buy. But that's every cartoon in the 1980s. Captain N is on this list in part because it's exceptionally bad at it. The show is about an everyday kid named Kevin being pulled into Videoland by a princess. First of all, Videoland sounds like a rental store, not a fantasy kingdom, or hell, even a video game kingdom. I don't know why they couldn't have called it Nintendo Land. Maybe they wanted their blatant marketing push to be a little bit more subtle. The first problem with the show is clearly the characters that they picked. Castlevania, Mega Man, incredibly popular series, good choices, but Kid Icarus? That wasn't even in the top 30 best-selling NES games. I know that using Link or Mario would have been redundant. You could have picked someone other than him. I mean, it took, what, 25 years for him to get another game afterwards? No, the Game Boy one doesn't count. Also, Simon looks like he's about to scale Mount Everest. Why does he look more like one of the ice climbers than an actual vampire slayer? And as for Mega Man... that's not Mega Man. How do you fuck up the default color of the Blue Bomber? Also, he has this really obnoxious voice that was obnoxiously popular back in that era.
Thanks, Your Highness. I'll roll mega muscles with this. A newspaper? Why, thanks, Duke.
Are you okay, Mega Man?
I hate my birthday. It reminds me that I'm different.
You'll also hear it on Toad from the Super Mario Bros. Show. You know, that type of voice that sounds like the character's been gargling with broken glass while they're taking a shit. Honestly, I'd rather listen to the cutscenes in Mega Man 8 than listen to this guy.
What do you make of these?
These? Seems to be energy resources. Must recover all the energy immediately, Mega Man.
But where is Dr. Wily?
That's a good question. We may be able to locate another energy emission from the radar room. When we find that meteor, we'll find Dr. Wily.
The villains, though, are even more baffling. Mother Brain, I get. Eggplant Wizard, I get because you chose Kid Icarus for some reason. I get Dr. Wily, but, King Hippo. You know that King Hippo isn't some diabolical evil bent on taking over the world, right? He's just a boxer. He's not even the villain of Punch-Out. I mean, Punch-Out doesn't have a villain, but he's not the final boss. Yeah, I get that you can't have Mike Tyson as a villain of your show. I mean, he's too busy solving mysteries, but if King Hippo is here, that means that Mike Tyson exists in Videoland, and the many countries that the other boxers come from exist in Videoland. Also, Mother Brain being the villain of the show kind of makes Samus's absence a little bit odd. I can only come to the conclusion that she's dead. The continuity of Captain N is strange. And don't say that this stuff doesn't matter or that I'm just nitpicking here. Like, kids are the people most likely to care about this kind of shit. This is what they bring up over the stories, or the writing, or the dialogue, or the voice acting. Especially when it's meant to advertise the games that they're going out to buy. To be honest, the show probably deserves its own review, but if I had to sum up its main problem in a few sentences, it's that I hate all of these characters. Every single one of them is annoying. Kevin is bland. The princess is bland. But everyone else is just annoying. Simon Belmont is the type of arrogant that you just want to punch in the face. Watching him makes me want to break every single copy of Castlevania that I can find, after intentionally dying a million goddamn times. Kid Icarus is annoying because he's another sanctimonious piece of shit. Yeah, I know he's an angel and it kinda comes with the territory. But what doesn't is his stupid talking gimmick.
Kid Icarus, Mega Man, we've got to find the princess.
Don't worry, it's Maximus. She's safe with Simon.
There's a reason that most NES games didn't have dialogue. Kid Icarus ends random words with Icus because that doesn't get old very quick-icus. And Mega Man, well, can we all agree that Mega Man should be a silent protagonist forever and ever? Like, make it a rule that if he talks again, Capcom's corporate headquarters gets teleported to the moon? It just seems that whenever the Blue Bomber starts talking, or when there's talking at all involving the Mega Man franchise, I get a little bit miffed. The next one is a tie. It's actually a three-way tie if you can believe it. It would be a four-way tie if I didn't disclude Fonz and the Happy Days gang. What's going in this entry? Number 7 is pretty much every single goddamn Hanna-Barbera animated spin-off of a sitcom. Did you know that Mork and Mindy had a cartoon? Well, it does. Did you know that Laverne and Shirley had a cartoon? They joined the army. Did you know that Gilligan's Island had a cartoon? It did, except it wasn't called Gilligan's Island. It was called Gilligan's Planet, and it was about them going into outer space.
The reason they couldn't build a boat on Gilligan's Island is because it would end the series.
No, I'm not joking. They tell you what happens in the theme song. Remember, the original Gilligan's Island has one of the most iconic theme songs of all time. Even if you've never seen the show before, you know the theme song.
A mate was a mighty sailing man, the skipper brave and sure. 5 passengers set sail that day for a 3-hour tour with Gilligan, the skipper too.
Here's the wet farts they put together for the cartoon's theme song.
Brand new story about the castaways.
We left our tiny island after years and months and days.
They're not even singing. They're just speaking in rhyme.
We built a little spaceship. It's crude, but it could fly.
And could they sound any more unenthused? I mean, I guess not, considering they're making an outer space cartoon spin-off of Gilligan's Island. That greatly misses the point of Gilligan's Island.
Oh yeah.
If the professor could build a fucking rocket ship out of coconuts, you'd think they'd be able to get off that island a lot sooner. And I thought the Fonz theme song was ridiculous.
Oh, now the gang got zapped into that time machine and they're like traveling through time. My.
Because the narrator was sounding like he was making it up as he went along. There really isn't much to say about these shows individually. They're all soulish cash-ins. I'd say that I don't know why they exist, but I do. We all know. They were extremely popular properties that a company could cash in on. And that company is Hanna-Barbera, which became the king of cashing in. People seem to be surprised when they watch how Tom and Jerry has been treated over the years. Like nowadays with things like Tom and Jerry and The Wizard of Oz. But I don't see why. That's completely normal and sane in Hanna-Barbera's oeuvre. This has been the company's shtick since the 70s. And if you're not liking the harsh words that I'm saying about them now, you're not gonna like the 70s list at all, when they're probably going to make up every single entry on the list. In the 70s, they had 80% control of the market, but as they kept producing soulless shit like this, that reused old animation, old plots, old properties, they went down to holding only 20% control of the market of children's entertainment in the 80s. Imagine if in a decade, Disney today fell down to having like only one television station and not having enough money to make an animated film at all. This is why one company having such a huge control over the entertainment market is so bad, by the way. Ahem. Just look at this shit.
Laverne, let's join the army!
Yeah, let's make an enormous decision on a whim that will cost us several years and quite possibly our lives. Sounds like it's gonna be a good rip-roaring time.
A commanding pig?
And didn't Laverne and Shirley already do this in an episode? On some level, this could be so bad it's good, which is why these shows aren't higher on this list. But seeing all these shows together, it just really makes me lose my sense of humor. It's all the fucking same. The novelty is lost. And keep in mind, this isn't even the first time they've done this. They've been doing it since the 70s with The Partridge Family in 2200 AD.
Cities rising in the sky, freeway traffic jetting by. Future's here for us to see. It's 2200 AD.
Throughout the entire decade of the 70s and even into the 80s, Hanna-Barbera had basically two ideas. That is it. Scooby-Doo ripoff and Flintstones ripoff. But sometimes they would get really creative and rip off something that they didn't own. Fonz and the Happy Days gang essentially tried to rip off Doctor Who. Laverne and Shirley, a series that, for what I can understand, took place in reality. In the intro of their cartoon, they get abducted by a spaceship. If I was an avid viewer of Laverne and Shirley, I don't know what I'd think. I'd either be outraged or laugh my ass off in wondering just what they put on the screen and what they were smoking to think that anyone would buy this. If you want an in-depth look, I did a review of an episode of Fonz and the Happy Days gang a couple of years back. It's rough around the edges, but it just showcases the insanity that's in pretty much all of these shows. I don't really have much new to say about any of them. So there was one type of show from the 1980s that I was the most hesitant to watch. Every decade has its own thing. The 1990s has gross outs. The 1970s has a lot of Scooby-Doo ripoffs. The 1980s had a lot of overly saccharine schlock. Your get-along gangs, Care Bears, all of that shit. Basically, these shows came about because moral guardians didn't want to do the job of actually being a parent and wanted the television to do it for them. And I had a lot to go through, but I actually think that I found the worst of all of them. Let's start with the theme song.
You're not dreaming, it's the moon dreamers. Dreaming up dreams for me and you. You're not dreaming, it's the moon dreamers. Making your sweetest dreams come true.
Let's just say I wish I knew about this one before I made my top worst theme songs list. It's painful to how much the singer tries to sing the words Moon Dreamers.
Not dreaming, it's the moon dreamers. It's the moon dreamers. It's the moon dreamers. Moon dreamers. Moon dreamers.
They just hold on that note and it hurts over and over again. So what are the Moon Dreamers? They're like the Care Bears, but instead of getting kids to care, they try and make it so that they have good dream. Which, to be honest with you, isn't a bad idea for a cartoon at all. It's actually a pretty great idea. This is probably the cartoon on the list that has the biggest chance to be good, except for the fact that it came out in the 1980s. And we can't really have anything introspective or deep in the 1980s. The animation isn't bad, but the character design of the Moon Dreamers is awful. Their heads are way too bulbous, and good god, that hair is the most 80s thing I've seen all day. And I'm doing a top 10 worst cartoons of the 1980s list. So that's saying something. And they sing, because of course they do.
We collect what dreams are made of from the outside galaxy.
Everything has to sing in the goddamn 80s. I don't know how to sing, but I'm pretty sure that this is the wrongest way to sing. You don't just keep holding a note at the end of every single sentence. I picked the show above things like the Care Bears or the Get Along Gang, mostly because of the singing, which comes up often and is horrendous. She kinda looks familiar. The 80s was not a good decade for you, huh, Rose? This might not be that fair, but the worst part of the show to me is that it's painful in that Shorty McShort kind of way. Imagine a show with this concept tried today, about a team of characters protecting kids' dreams from nightmares, and maybe their insecurities, about their problems during the day. It could be really interesting, and you could show some very interesting locales and have all kinds of crazy themes. While the locations in the show do look visually pleasing, they're very reminiscent of the Care Bears, to the point where it looks like they're blatantly copying the Care Bears. The villain is some witch who hates the Moon Dreamers because she can't sleep. Honestly, it's really stupid. Anything that is there at all, it's largely just fluff. If you want to see the story concept done well, there's a Courage the Cowardly Dog episode that uses this plot infinitely better. Another big problem with the show is that it takes its dreamy atmosphere just a touch bit too far. Every song in the show is written like a lullaby. And with the visuals, I wouldn't be surprised if anyone watching the show was asleep by the time it was over. You know, beyond the other reasons. That being that it's so boring. Moon Dreamers. The most exhausting show in the... So, cartoons made with absolutely no effort specifically to sell a product are pretty bad. You've seen plenty of them on this list. We've established that fact by now. But here's the question. What do you do to one of these if you want to take it to the next level of bad? How do you make it the worst marketing push of the 1980s? You take your cartoon based on a product that shouldn't have a cartoon, and you make it a baby's cartoon. Because potatoes. They made a cartoon about Mr. Potato Head. No, they didn't make a cartoon about Mr. Potato Head. They made the cartoon about Mr. Potato Head's kids. I remember them selling a Mr. Potato Head and Mrs. Potato Head, but I don't remember them selling any Potato Head kids. While making a lot of these cartoons seem like a good idea at the time, or at least a better idea than they do now, I'd imagine that making a cartoon about the Potato Heads was a worse idea at the time. After all, this was like a decade before Toy Story came around, and it figured out one of the hidden truths of animation. That you need to give a character, even if it's based on a toy, a goddamn character. None of the Potato Head kids have any goddamn personality. Like, at all. Usually in a bad 1980s cartoon, they'd give each one, say, one unique trait to distinguish each of them from each other. Here they give each of the characters a different hat. That is the only thing that distinguishes them from each other. Although I've said this over and over again. Is Potato Head Kids really that bad compared to the rest of the list? How is this worse than Captain N or Moon Dreamers? Generally, how I make my lists is that I watch the cartoons, and the sooner the show makes me quit an annoyance or boredom or whatever, the higher the show ends up on the list. I go back and I watch through the whole thing again, but it gives me a good general idea as to where my gut feeling is. I got to about 5 minutes of one episode before I had to quit. Potato Head Kids is number 4 on the list because it has one of the worst songs that I've ever heard in any cartoon ever. Let me make this clear. The worst song that I've heard in any cartoon ever. You think that SpongeBob has annoying songs. The Atlantis Square Pandas songs are Bohemian Rhapsody and Sweet Child of Mine compared to Surfing Potatoes. This song hurts my ears in a way that I can't describe. The imagery is random and stupid, the lyrics are juvenile, but oh my god, the singing. The singing is just horrendous. Do you really think I'm continuing after this? You can't redeem your cartoon after a song like this. This is the only song that I've ever come across in a cartoon that made me say, no, that's it, I'm done. I'm never watching this show ever again. Normally it takes badly placed suicide jokes or ineptly offensive character portrayals to do that, but no. This show did it with one song and the sheer force of annoyance. I feel like I'm losing my hearing. Hello, Hanna-Barbera. I couldn't imagine you being on this list. Again. Thankfully for the final time. And yes, this time, Hanna-Barbera really was the one who made this. Yeah, Mr. T had a cartoon. Do I sound excited? Well, I shouldn't, because, believe it or not, the Mr. T cartoon isn't as good as it sounds. I know that I've been having a hard time making many of the choices on this list seem exciting or interesting, but that's because the cartoons in the 1980s were often not exciting or interesting. Most of the entries on this list are boring. How do you make Mr. T boring?
Don't touch my van, sucker. If you do, I'll come back and feed you your socks.
Simple. You be Hanna-Barbera. You make it the same as every other goddamn 70s, 80s Hanna-Barbera show in existence. Stilted animation that only moves once in a blue moon. Check. Shameless celebrity star and or cameo. Check. Scooby-Doo ripoff. Check, check, checkity check. This might not be worse than any of the other Hanna-Barbera shows that are on this list or in existence, but it's this high up on the list because I am just that fucking sick of the Hanna-Barbera shtick. You wanna know something funny? If this show was worse, it would probably be lower on this list, because that would mean that the show was interesting in some way, shape, or form. I had a lot more fun in the other lists. The worst cartoons of the 1980s aren't as offensive as the worst of the 2010s. They're not as gross as the worst of the 90s. But they're the most soulless shit that I've ever seen. This is the kind of shit that happens when you do not care. I could talk more about the show itself, but do you really care what's in the Mr. T cartoon? No, you don't. No one cares. And they made sure of that because Hanna-Barbera had a rule against being creative. A show with this concept has no right to be this fucking boring. The only thing of note about it is that somehow this animated cartoon has a camera problem where they can't keep it still. And I know it's a problem with the actual cartoon and not a recording because I bought the goddamn DVD. Yeah, that's gonna be sitting on my mantelpiece, staring me down in shame for the rest of my life. That is the least excited crowd that I have ever heard, but considering the show we're talking about, it's completely appropriate. The Mr. T cartoon. All of the nutritional value of chewed up gum, with none of the flavor. What the hell is this? I wouldn't blame you if you've never heard of this show before. I haven't, so you're probably going to need to bear with me. Camp Candy was a show that was produced by John Candy, and he voices a character named John Candy, who is the camp counselor in a Camp Candy. And in the vein of many other celebrity-based cartoons, it's absolutely awful. I'm going to try and be as nice as possible considering that this particular celebrity is dead, and I have enjoyed many of his performances, but I do find Camp Candy to be one of the worst cartoons of this decade. And I know what you're thinking, it doesn't look too bad, at least in stills. As far as the actual animation goes, it clearly does that technique where they just take one drawing of the character and move them across the screen. Characters just end up staring into space way too often. There's very little animation in this animation, and the actual quality of what we see seems to depend on the particular episode. Sometimes the character will speak with the wrong voice. It's not just that they sound similar and I'm getting confused. In one episode, a girl speaks with one of the boys' voices.
Scary, isn't it?
It's only some dumb thing made out of paper mache.
Perfect, Pinky. This sea serpent is just what we need.
In the episode Fool's Goals, I don't know if there's something wrong with the recording that I got, but the lip syncing is just plain awful. Like, the worst I've ever seen, where even sound effects are placed incorrectly.
Let's go right to step two, the safe way to put out a campfire.
Sometimes above the vocal track, although it seems to be just this one episode, barring in mind that I haven't seen all of the episodes. However, one thing that's terrible in every single episode, and consistently so, is the theme song.
The flea bites, the bee bites, the bark of the tree bites, the quietness of darkness, the stories told by firelight, the long nights, the food fights.
John Candy was many things. He was not a singer. From what I understand, the songs in the show are supposed to sound like campfire songs. And they do, in the sense that anyone singing has no business singing. And if they weren't doing it in the middle of the woods, they'd be shot for disturbing the peace. The show is technically broken, but what puts it this high in the list is the writing. I could ignore how bland most of the characters are. I've been doing this for the most part for this entire list. The only exception is the villain. That I can't ignore. I mean, at first he seems to be your typical cartoon bad guy. He wants to buy and demolish the kids' summer camp to build condos. However, I don't think the show really understands what makes someone the bad guy. In one episode, the kids come up with a hoax monster to help one of their friends cheat and win a reporting reward. So the villain is the one who hires someone to expose the hoax as a hoax and prevent cheating. Maybe that's a fluke. I mean, sometimes even the best shows accidentally have their bad guys in the moral right. There's a particularly bad example of this, though. It's the episode Fool's Gold. You know, the one with the broken audio. Candy ends up burning down the kitchen because reasons. So what does the evil Xavier Rex DeForest III do? He calls the fire department, and our narrator John Candy calls him a jerk for doing so.
Rex DeForest didn't waste any time in reporting the disaster.
Boy, what a snitch!
For calling the fire department. The firefighter is even portrayed as an asshole who just wants to get the camp shut down.
You, the owner of this place? Yes, sir, I'm the head counselor of Camp Candy. You mean the former Camp Candy, don't you? Former camp?
Well, it says right here, clear as day. Camps have got to have a kitchen. No kitchen, no camp.
What are you saying?
I'm saying, if you don't have a brand spanking new kitchen standing on this spot in exactly 1 week, I'm closing this camp for good. Have a nice day!
I don't care if this isn't an educational show or whatever, even though it seems to try and teach lessons, but when you portray calling the fire department as the wrong thing to do, your show has something seriously wrong with it. It's things like this that make me find this show worse than Little Clowns of Happy Town. This is ignoring the smaller thing, like a Family Guy style joke where the firefighter runs past Smokey the Bear.
Hey, Bozo, where's the fire?
And it being portrayed as A-okay for the kids to bring home a crazy old guy who they found in the middle of the forest. Yes, in this show, firefighters are bad and you should never ever call them. But you should bring creepy old people you find in the middle of the woods straight home. They're cool and friendly. And there's this thing with this nurse who has a rather excessive crush on the creator's self-insert characters in ways that aren't exactly appropriate for this kind of show. Camp Candy is just one of the worst. And I'm glad that history has thoroughly erased this. And now for some dishonorable mentions, because as you might have imagined, the 1980s was just filled to the brim with crap, and I couldn't fit it all on this list. The Legend of Zelda.
Well, excuse me, princess.
While the Super Mario Bros. Super Show had some corny charm to it, I could definitely not come up with the same excuse for this one. Yeah, they only had 2 games to work with at the time, and Link didn't have any established personality to work with, but let's be honest, if Link was a silent protagonist throughout this entire show, never showing any personality whatsoever, the entire thing would be a million times better. Consider it my number 11. Gary Coleman Show. In this show, Gary Coleman plays a guardian angel. Because Gary Coleman is actually dead in real life, I'm not even going to touch this one. The Chuck Norris Show.
Chuck Norris stars in Chuck Norris Karate Commandos. Chuck Norris, he's got nerves of steel and strength to match.
The only reason this show didn't make it on the list is because it didn't make 13 episodes. I tried counting how many times that the words Chuck Norris is said in the intro, but only Chuck Norris has an ego to count to numbers that big. The Get Along Gang! You know, I don't really understand the moral guardians. Any time that they use complaining about violent cartoons, games, movies, or whatever could probably be better used actually spending time with their kids, or making sure that the media that they wanted to give their kids is right for them. Think about all the time that was spent concepting, voicing, and animating this piece of shit. That's all time that everyone involved never spent with their kids. Unless the people complaining about this shit don't have any kids, but that would be a little bit too hypocritical for them, right? The Pac-Man cartoon. This was the very first video game cartoon ever made. It sucks, but I will give it some credit. It actually managed to give the characters a not stupid personality, even though the characters didn't have any in the games. And it actually remembered that Pac-Man was yellow. That shouldn't be a criteria, but considering Captain N, it is. Mighty Orbots. Remember the toy line Transformers? Well, it had a cartoon that confuses anime fans to this day, and that franchise had a ripoff called the GoBots, with its toys and its show. It was so much of a ripoff that it had its own ripoff too. The Mighty Orbots are a ripoff of a ripoff. Still more originality than the last night though. Karate Kid. And here's our requisite, this would be on the list if I could find footage. Little Clowns of Happy Town. It'd be number 3. Now, on to number 1. Now, usually when I do one of these lists, there's some competition for number 1. In the 90s list, from a watching standpoint, Mega Babies is clearly the worst. But when it comes to just the fact that this show exists, The Wacky World of Tex Avery was the worst. And this is a problem I have doing every single decade's list. It's going to be a problem in the 2010s as well. The only exception is the 1980s. When I watched my number 1 pick, I knew that it'd be my number 1 pick, and no other show came close to dethroning it. I present to you Kid Video, the worst cartoon of the 1980s. While the Nutshack was just disgusting, and the Wacky World of Tex Avery was insulting, Kid Video is one of the most incoherent shows that I have ever seen. The premise is that some random band made for the show named Kid Video was sucked into a cartoon world by an evil villain to make them musical slaves, and I'm already getting Captain N flashbacks.
I'm taking you to the flip side.
What happened? Ay, ay, ay. We look like cartoons.
Just look at some of this shit.
Better slow down, kid.
It looks like Leon, the mayor of Neon City.
See how poorly this was made? This was in the first episode. And no, the animation and the production does not get better. Now, I would have assumed that some of the audio had been botched in this particular recording, as I had to get this through a recording because it's never been released on DVD or VHS or whatever. But no, this particular recording didn't edit out the commercials from the time. And they sound perfectly fine in comparison. Not perfect, but way better than the actual show. Like with Kid and Play, sometimes the background music drowns out the talking because it's a show about a band. The music is more important than the personalities of the characters, because they don't have any personality. Not to mention that the background music in this gets really repetitive, and it sounds like it's sampling popular songs from the time. So what is the first episode about? So, instead of going home, the band wants to go to a town where everyone is a teenager, but now everyone in the town is old because a villain named Master Blaster wants them all to see his band. But nobody wants to because they only do covers. Even though the premise of the show is that Master Blaster wants Kid Video to be his musical slave, and every single song they do is basically a cover, or straight using the song. Is there anything that I'm forgetting?
Yeah, they can't play anything unless the Master Blaster kidnaps a hot rock act and plugs them into it.
Then he must have Lionel Richie, and there's no one to save him but us.
Oh no! The evil Master Blaster has captured Lionel Richie, the Fiend! But they can't save Lionel Richie right now, because they need to go to the library. It's okay though, the library is filled with magical books that contain all kinds of things. Lions, weather, and of course, Electric Avenue by Eddie Grant. This will tell them exactly the right route to get where they need to go to, because reasons. So, the California Raisins misinterpreting the lyrics of Shop Around is one thing, but doing the same thing with Electric Avenue is even more insulting because of the song. It sounds very upbeat, but it's a deep song about unemployment, racism, poverty, and was written in response to a riot. The song only came out 2 years before this episode, by the way. But no, Kid Video has to go to Electric Avenue to find a talking poster. And then they must figure out the rest of the quote-unquote riddle.
Yeah, and the second part of that song said to take it higher, whatever that means.
Well, the song's lyrics mean that they're going to start at Electric Avenue, which is a real place where the riots occurred, and then they're going to take it higher, as in to a higher authority.
Hi. Look! That clock. Maybe it has something to do with it.
Or, you know, that, you incompetent morons. Do I even need to go on? Kid Video is an incoherent, incomprehensible, incompetent, insulting, inebriated mess with shit production values. It's clear that no one gave any kind of a care. The only thing I really like is how, at the end of the intro, the fairy says that she'll explain things later. But no, she never does. This video is a milestone goal over at my Patreon, so I would not be able to do this one without the help of my patrons. Their names should be on the screen right now, and I would like to thank them for their kind donations. If you would like to donate as well, the link is in the description. My patron donations help me create these videos, and they give me some kind of security beyond YouTube's crazy algorithms, which is getting more and more important in this day and age.